Let's go to Capitol Hill. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler speaking.
From his testimony and next steps in our work to hold President Trump accountable for his conduct. Robert Mueller is a man of honor and integrity. He has led a life defined by service to his country. Some have argued that because Director Mueller was reluctant to testify and seemed older than some remembered him, his work is somehow diminished. It is not. Before he ever stepped into our hearing room, the director had rendered our country a great and necessary public service. He showed through his report and his indictments that the United States was attacked and remains under siege by a foreign adversary. He showed that the Trump campaign both welcomed and benefited from this attack on our country. And he showed that the president repeatedly lied to cover it up. And if that were not enough, Director Mueller's testimony removed all doubt. He told us that Donald Trump obstructed justice and abused his office by tampering with witnesses, attempting to block the investigation, and attempting to fire the special counsel. He told us that Donald Trump lied to the public about the Trump Tower meeting in New York, lied to the public about his plans for Trump Tower in Moscow, and lied in his written responses to the special counsel. He told us in a remarkable exchange with Mr. Liu that but for the Department of Justice policy from prohibiting from doing so, he would have indicted President Trump. Indeed, it is clear that any other citizen of this country who behaved as the president has would have been charged with multiple crimes. Notably, my Republican colleagues were unable to refute a single one of these facts. So where do we go from here? We will continue to seek testimony from key fact witnesses. As many of you know, the committee has authorized several additional subpoenas. Our work will continue into the August recess, and we will use those subpoenas if we must. We will also continue to seek important documents from the Department of Justice and the White House. We have made some progress on this front. There appears to be compelling evidence of the president's misconduct outside of the four corners of the redacted version of the Mueller report, and we will work to uncover that evidence as well. Finally, today, we are filing an application for the grand jury material underlying the Mueller report. That information is critically important for our ability to examine witnesses, including former White House counsel Don McGahn, and to investigate the president's misconduct. I will not comment on reports of our ongoing negotiations with Mr. McGahn, but unless he complies with our accommodation efforts in very short order, we expect to file an additional suit to enforce our subpoena for his testimony. And that will be next week or earlier next week. I should note that the committee could not have brought these lawsuits without the help and support of Speaker Pelosi, who is as dedicated to holding this president accountable for his crimes as any of us gathered here today. Before I take your questions, let me share just a few sentences from the petition we are filing with the court today. Quote, because Department of Justice policies will not allow prosecution of a sitting president, the United States House of Representatives is the only institution of the federal government that can now hold President Trump accountable for these actions. To do so, the House must have access to all the relevant facts and consider whether to exercise its full Article I powers, including a constitutional duty power of the utmost gravity, recommendation of articles of impeachment. That duty falls in the first instance to the House Committee on the Judiciary. Close quote. As I said, that was from the court filing today. We take that responsibility seriously. No one can be above the law, not even President Trump. We'll now take some questions.
So, half of the members up here
and let me just say, we take questions when they ask members of the committee to field the questions as well. Go ahead.
members up here have come out in support of impeachment. How are you dealing with disagreements with the Speaker on that issue? And especially heading into this 6-week-long recess, do you expect that those divisions to go away soon?
I don't know that there are real divisions with the Speaker. I would refer you to her earlier comments in which she said that we must make the strongest case. If our committee is going to recommend articles of impeachment to the House, we must make the strongest possible case both to our colleagues and to the American public. On that, we're in total agreement.
So, could there be a point, though, Mr. Chairman, where you break from the Speaker and you announce publicly your support for impeachment?
We are, as I said, and as is clear in the court filings, we are exercising our full Article 1 authority. We are continuing investigation of the president's malfeasances, and we will do what we feel, and we will consider what we have to consider, including whether we should recommend articles of impeachment to the House. That's the job of our committee. We may decide to recommend articles of impeachment at some point. We may not. That remains to be seen. And there's no point speculating on whether the Speaker or anybody else will agree with our decision at that point.
What's holding you back from publicly voicing your support for an impeachment inquiry?
Well, if I can jump in, I mean, impeachment's not.
Can you speak at the microphone, please?
Sorry. Okay. Impeachment isn't a binary thing that you either are or you aren't. What we've been saying and what we've been doing is starting a process where we're engaging in an investigation to see if we should recommend articles of impeachment. It's a process. We've started it some months ago in some ways while waiting for the report and holding the hearings that we've already had. So, it's an ongoing process. The court filings today are the next step, and we'll continue down that road, to see whether we have the strong case that is needed to put to the American people.
Chairman Nadler, what about the idea here, though, that at the hearing yesterday, on Wednesday here, Speaker Pelosi said that they crossed a threshold, called this historic. What did Robert Mueller fail to do? Obviously, you said that he should not be diminished by his presentation. But what would you have liked to gotten out of him in that presentation on Wednesday?
He didn't fail to do anything yesterday.
He
2
didn't
days
fail
ago.
to animate this. We heard that repeatedly from members on your side of the aisle that he failed to breathe life into that report.
Well, if you showed up expecting a Broadway show, sure, you may have been disappointed. But if you listened to what he said that the Russians attacked us. They had a preference for Donald Trump. The Trump campaign welcomed it and planned around it. And when the police investigated it, they took great lengths to cover it up, including the president. And the president is the only person in America who would be shielded from being held accountable because of what they did. That is pretty cut and dry. And what you've seen is not members who have called for impeachment saying, take me off of that call in light of what Mr. Mueller has said. 6 members since have come forward and have said, add me to that call for impeachment.
Can I ask one thing? I'm sorry. The one thing Robert Mueller failed to do in that hearing is he failed to exonerate the president. In fact, he said he could not exonerate the president. So that, I think, is the answer to your question.
When members answer, why don't you identify yourselves, too, for the press? That's Mary Gay Scanlon.
May I just add an extra point
Sheila Jackson.
on, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Throughout the entire time of Mr. Mueller's presence before the House Judiciary Committee, he evidenced elements of a crime. He was not in any way shortchanging his answers that crimes had been committed. He said yes to the 3 elements of obstruction. He said yes that one element of obstruction could result in jail time. He also said that, when I say said, answered questions that said you did not have to have an underlying crime to be able to be convicted of obstruction. I don't think the American people have ever heard that in that manner before. I know there are some who may have read both volumes, but they never heard it as it was played out with the members of this committee, that when you finished the Judiciary Committee's questioning, and when you started with Chairman Nadler, who did an enormous job on framing our questioning by getting right to the meat of the issue of obstruction and then exoneration, which Director Mueller openly and I think quite vividly said that he was not the president exonerated. And then we continued methodically to reinforce that to the extent that the elements of obstruction, which I wanted to just mention here for a moment, an obstructive act, a nexus between the act and an official proceeding, and corrupt intent, was associated with the actions of this president. The American people have never heard that. And I will close by simply saying on this question that you asked, for those of us who've seen Director Mueller before this committee on a number of years as FBI director, he has always been stoic and a former Marine, just right to the point. He certainly has an enormous talent of investigation. So when he came today, or yesterday, Wednesday, he made true of what he said to the committee. He was going to stick with the report. He did that. But in doing so, every single question that would warrant someone being convicted of a crime was answered.
Steve Cohen.
Thank you. I'd just like to add one thing that I think has been overlooked. Mr. Mueller made a point of saying, in a response to a question from Mr. Buck, which I think he probably would like to have taken back, that the president could be indicted after he left office. Now, Mr. Mueller earlier said, and it may be in the report, that one of the reasons to get all that information was to get it from witnesses while it was fresh in their mind and preserve it for later use. If you didn't believe you had a criminal act, why would you want to preserve the evidence? So by the very fact that he preserved the evidence and said it was necessary to get these people while it was fresh in their mind and their best recollection, meant that he's basically saying he obstructed justice and the time may have to come after his first term, or his last term, which would be his first term.
Let me just summarize one thing here. I believe that the hearing with Director Mueller was an inflection point. It was an inflection point because it accomplished two things. One, you heard Director Mueller say that that we were attacked by the Russians, that the Trump campaign welcomed the attack, but welcomed the assistance of the Russians, that there's substantial evidence of crimes of obstruction of government, obstruction of justice by the president, and that he was not exonerated, and that the mantra that the president and the attorney general have been telling the country for months now, that they found no collusion, no obstruction, and the president was totally exonerated, was totally untrue. It changed that. Even you heard the president now saying that the investigation was treasonous. He wouldn't be saying that if he still thought he could get away with saying the investigation established no obstruction, no collusion, and totally exonerated him. So he broke the lie that has been propagated by the Attorney General and by the President, and we can and presented to the American people the stark conclusions, which we can now fill out by getting other evidence and getting the witnesses and so forth.
Mr. Chairman. Madeline Dean from Pennsylvania. I just wanted to say two things. One, about the performance of Mr. Mueller. I have nothing but the highest regard for Mr. Mueller and his life of service to this country. And what I believe we really should be focused on is not the performance of Mr. Mueller, but the performance or behaviors of this president obstructing justice. That's the performance you need to be examining. The performance of the Trump administration welcoming, wallowing in interference by Russia. The performance of Russia interfering with our elections in massive and sweeping ways that will continue. And a Senate yesterday that did nothing, in fact, blocked attempts to take care of or protect our elections. Those are the performances we need to be looking at. Those are the behaviors. Trump, his campaign, Russia, and obstruction. That's what we need to be looking at.
Mr. Chairman, you've been fighting for these grand jury materials for some time. but you've also been engaging in an accommodation process with the Department of Justice. They've allowed you to view some documents. Even in a May letter, you said you've made clear you're not seeking from the department any information or documents that are properly subject to Rule 60 to grand jury material. So why is this material so important to you? What do you think you will find, and will that hurt the accommodation process you already have with the department for these other documents you want?
Well, we have been engaged in accommodation processes with the Justice Department, with various other witnesses, to get testimony and to get documents and so forth. It has been largely fruitless, but it is necessary to do that if you're going to go into court to enforce your subpoenas, which we're doing. With respect to 6E, that is to say grand jury testimony, we have not requested it previously. You have to go to court and request it. In previous cases, the special prosecutor, the committee went into court and requested this 20 years ago, 40 years ago, and the Attorney General went into court and supported the application. This time, we're going into court today. I don't expect the Attorney General to support the application. Indeed, he may oppose it. But we have to see the underlying grand jury material of a lot of things about the Mueller report, which will be very informative to us.
But doesn't this set a dangerous precedent if this were to get leaked out? You know, why is this information so important?
The information is important, and I can't characterize the specific importance because I don't know the specific contents, obviously. Because it's at the foundation. Much of the investigation by the special prosecutor or the special counsel was in the form of grand jury presentations, and that's what and you have to see that. And in the case of Leanne Jaworski and Ken Starr, the committee in both cases was given that information, was given access to that information, and we need that information too to make a lot of different judgments.
Mr. Chairman, there's a vigorous debate in your caucus about whether or not to formally open an impeachment inquiry. You know, given what you've said about this filing, comments that you've made in hearings in recent weeks, I mean, are you all beginning to shade into an impeachment inquiry, even if you haven't held the formal vote of the House? Is that what's going on here?
What's going on?
Smart boy.
We don't need it.
What's going on is that I think too much has been made of the phrase an impeachment inquiry. We are doing what our court filing says we are doing, what I said we are doing, and that is to say we are using our full Article I powers to investigate the conduct of the president and to consider what remedies there are. Among other things, we will consider obviously whether to recommend articles of impeachment. We may not do that. We may do that, but that's the conclusion at the end of the process. You may want to call that an inquiry or not. I think people, when they think of an inquiry, think of a formal House vote to direct the committee to hold an inquiry. That's happened in the past, but there have also been instances where it didn't happen. The committee is exercising its authority to investigate all these scandals and to decide what to do about them, which could include articles of impeachment. And we've filed that with the court, and we've told that to the court, and we're going to do that.
Do you believe that you already are at that point of an inquiry? You believe what the Judiciary Committee is doing right now is an inquiry into impeachment?
We are doing exactly what I said a moment ago we are doing. That is to say, we are examining and investigating the various malfeasances and crimes and so forth of the president. We are going into court and asking for more information and to enforce our subpoenas. We are telling the court that we are doing this not just as part of normal oversight, but also because as part of our Article I authority and responsibility to consider all remedies, including possibility of articles of impeachment, and that's what we're going to do. Now, whether you call that an inquiry or whatever you want to call that, that's what we've been doing and we are doing and will continue to do.
The court battle could take a little bit of time. Do you have a deadline? Even if it's expedited, it could take a while. Do you have a deadline in your mind as to when you all will make this decision? And would you do this in an election year?
It's not this decision, a lot of different decisions. And no, I don't.
Mr.
Nadler, you've mentioned the idea of having the strongest possible case before you go to court, but isn't the strongest possible case to get 6E material being in an impeachment inquiry?
The strongest possible case is to tell the court what we're telling the court, which you'll see in the court. I think we're going to give you copies of the court filings, and I quoted part of the relevant paragraph, and that is that we are, and I'll read it again. The House must have access to all relevant facts, consider whether to exercise its full Article 1 powers, including a constitutional power of the utmost gravity, recommendation of articles of impeachment. That falls in the first instance to the House Committee on the Judiciary. What we are telling the court, and one of the purposes of telling the court is to say we are exercising our highest authority, is that we are considering the malfeasances of the president. We're considering what remedies we can do, including the possibility of articles of impeachment.
Mr. Chairman.
Your opening.
Jamie?
Well, but I was just going to say that there's no formal constitutional or statutory or even House rule for how an impeachment inquiry is to begin. And so it means different things to different people. For a lot of people believe we've been in an impeachment inquiry ever since we started looking into potential high crimes and misdemeanors and the misconduct of the executive branch. Other people think an impeachment inquiry doesn't begin until you actually have articles of impeachment. I would say we are in an impeachment investigation. And as to the results of the investigation, it could lead to articles of impeachment or it could lead to something else. But from my personal standpoint, I think we are in an impeachment investigation.
That's why we're so confused about this. Are you saying that we're not, somebody says it's not binary. Yeah. How is this not binary? I mean, either we're in it or we're not, right?
When you look at different Congresses and the way they've addressed it, they've done it in different ways. Nixon was done different than with President Clinton, and what we are suggesting here is this court filing is the first time that you're seeing us telegraph to the court that one of the remedies we have is impeachment, and to consider whether that should be used. So that opens up and should activate that grand jury material. So I support what Mr. Raskin just said, which is this is an impeachment investigation, whether we should recommend articles of impeachment to our colleagues.
So this is an escalation.
You're saying there's no difference between what you're doing now and an impeachment inquiry, correct?
In effect, what I'm saying is that we are. Well, I suppose there is one difference which you could draw. I mean, if you said that an impeachment inquiry is when you're considering only impeachment, that's not what we're doing. We are investigating all of this, and we are going to see what remedies we could recommend, including the possibility of articles of impeachment. We're not limited to that, but that's very much the possibility as a result of what we're doing.
So
in your opening, can I ask you a follow-up? You made a comment on, you said there appears to be compelling evidence of the president's misconduct outside the four corners of the Mueller report. Can you elaborate on that statement and where else you guys are looking at for evidence? Pelosi's referred to the president's financial records a lot this week and looking for something there.
Well, they were all, for example, even the special prosecutor, the special counsel referred to Manafort giving internal polling data and other information from the Trump campaign to someone who was identified as an agent of the Russian government, doing that for months. Now, that wasn't followed up on by the report, but one raises the obvious question of what use would be detailed polling reports about Wisconsin and Michigan and so forth to the Russians, except to help direct their interference, their trolling, their media operation, their social media operations. That would be very, very serious, obviously. But we know they were giving this internal polling documentation, which is normally very closely held secret in any campaign, to the Russians. For what purpose? Why did the Russians want it? Why were they giving it? That was not followed up and what conceivable purpose other than to help them interfere in the election. That was not followed up. Also, you look at some of the financial things. Also, you look at the whole violation of the emoluments clause of the Constitution, which seems to be systematic and ongoing. There are a lot of different things that weren't investigated by the Mueller investigation, which conceived of its purview as very restricted purview. And we have to look at, we'll see where we want to go in all of these.
Chairman Nadler, just to be clear, is this an escalation? This going to court today, is this an escalation in your investigation?
It's the next step in our investigation, and yes. I don't know if you call it an escalation.
Can I, Mr. Chair, I want to say just one thing, just very quickly. Yeah, thank you.
If I can leave you with this one theme that seems to be lost, and that is what you have seen, what the chairman has guided the committee in doing very effectively, is to establish the misconduct of the presidency of the United States or this president. I think we cannot lose that. And on Wednesday, it became more embedded, not only in our record, but it should be in the psychic of those who are looking and listening, and we'll see it over and over again. American people cannot ignore the persistent and continuous misconduct that we're investigating. The 6E materials will help us delve even further into other aspects of misconduct. The journey of an impeachment inquiry or a non-impeachment inquiry is that when you determine that there is misconduct, you then move to Article 1 and you proceed, Section 2, Clause 5, and then you proceed with the idea of articles of impeachment. We're not running away from articles of impeachment. We're building it on the trail of misconduct that was evidenced very deeply on Wednesday. And now we're going to make a journey that also includes Don McGahn, who, if he does not comply, will be subject to jail time and fines. This is yesterday was yesterday. We're now moving further into the deepness of the investigation on the misconduct of this administration.
Sylvia, excuse me.
Veronica. Just
Veronica
real quickly,
Escobar of Texas.
to answer very clearly, yes, we're crossing a threshold. Absolutely. When you think about the mode that we were operating under before, it really was an oversight function. We're now crossing a threshold with the filing of this with this filing, and we are now officially entering into an examination of whether or not to recommend the articles of impeachment. So we have crossed a threshold. I just wanted to make that real clear.
Thank you very much.
Ultimately leave office being impeached by this House, regardless of timeline?
I don't know.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much.
All right, you've been listening to House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler and other members of Congress, Democrats, talking about possible impeachment inquiries into the administration, into the President of the United States. The chairman there saying that Robert Mueller told us, and to use his words, that the president lied and obstructed justice. That is what they believe was made clear when Mr. Mueller testified before the House earlier this week. You heard earlier in the morning Nancy Pelosi saying that she is still gathering all the information and speaking to members of her caucus. But let's just remember that Congress is headed into their summer recess, and that could certainly take the wind out of the sails for any kind of impeachment inquiry that they may be discussing right now. So we'll have to see where all that leads.